Ever wondered how trailblazing risk leaders navigate uncertainty with finesse and confidence? Uncover the surprising connections between their personal journey and professional prowess, and get ready to learn and elevate your risk management game with the RiskMasters podcast. Join host Julian Hay in collaboration with Risk.net as they delve into hidden gems of risk leadership through engaging conversations and thought-provoking insights from board directors to chief risk officers and business leaders.
In a world of deep uncertainty, the ability to adapt is more important than the ability to predict. In risk management, resilience isn't enough. We need to build systems that thrive in uncertainty. In part 1 of my conversation with Roger Spitz, we explored why traditional risk models fail and how organizations can use foresight to navigate deep uncertainty. Now in part 2, we go even deeper into the practical application of foresight. Roger shares how organizations can move beyond static risk frameworks, embrace scenario planning for systemic risks, and develop anti-fragile strategies that strengthen under disruption. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like, follow, and leave a review. Your feedback helps us continue bringing insights from industry leaders. For more resources, show notes, and articles, please visit avtm.com. I'm Julien A, and this is RiskMasters. Welcome back to RiskMasters. This is part 2 of my conversation with Roger Spitz, where we dive deeper into the practical application of foresight in risk management. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I recommend starting there before continuing. Now, let's pick up where we left off. So with that, I think and perhaps here it's about getting your crystal ball out a little bit, but let's see. What risk do you think organizations are currently underestimating in the context of what you just said?
Yeah, so there are a few thoughts on that. And I think the first thought I'm going to share, and it's worth what it's worth, everybody has their own perspective, but one of the things I forgot maybe to mention is that I also, and it kind of informs my answer to this, I also work with the World Economic Forum as part of the Global Foresight Network, and the remit is also that, this, how do you be future prepared? And as you know, the World Economic Forum, amongst others, have a lot of deep work around risk and how they interact or not, and the future preparedness and resiliency of systems. And I also work a lot with boards and anticipatory governance and Institute of Directors and the likes. And so that kind of helps inform my own perspectives. I think one of the perspectives touches upon what you just mentioned, which is, and again, I'm not a risk guy per se, so forgive me for any kind of deviances or inaccuracies, and we can exchange on that. But I get the feeling from the investment banking world, and I would imagine there's also the possibility on the risk side, but you'll tell me, that we use scenarios and scenario planning and scenario development in a slightly different way. And the way I imagine it is slightly more running different scenarios for other possibilities. But the way, certainly in banking we did it, but I'm guessing it might be an element around risk, is that the way you do it is that you're still modelizing variations, variables, parameters for different scenarios and looking at what the outcomes of those scenarios are and relying on those outcomes as possibilities, as if the model was accurate and truthful, as if there was data on the future, as if it was predictable, stable, and controllable. And I think that certainly for foresight, you're not necessarily worried about the outcomes of the model. I would say there is no model, there is no data on the future. We pay very much attention to signals and to emerging signals, and we form views on possibilities that we feel are plausible. But ultimately, there's no individual scenario per se which we're relying on as an outcome or set of scenarios. We fundamentally consider that the world is non-predictable, is asymmetric, that there'll be an important area of emergence. And so the scenario of kind of best case, worst case, mid case, or whatever, still doesn't necessarily fully integrate deep unpredictability, non-linearity, and the need to kind of see how things interact and cascade and continue to evolve and emerge, and what that means for sense-making and decision-making. So I would say that one of the areas when you speak to organizations and you get a sense of how they're dealing with it is they're building in what they see as scenario management, which in reality is just sensitivity analysis, but doing the same thing with sensitivity analysis sometimes. The other thing is that there's still a little bit of a reliance on the world being stable, linear, and predictable. In other words, you're not necessarily building a resiliency in the system. You kind of have this, whereas the cost, if there's an inverse relationship between prediction and uncertainty, and the cost of relying on business as usual as a stable, predictable, and linear world is increasing. And I think organizations kind of feel, well, you can't prepare for scenarios, it's too expensive, and somehow we'll come back to normal, or somehow we have some sense, but the reality is that you need a different operating system to think about deep uncertainty. It's like COVID, it's like Starlink versus the traditional satellites. For COVID, you kind of think, okay, you save a few $1 billion, but then you end up wasting trillions, So which one was more expensive? And then if you take single points of failure, it's very interesting this is not a risk management thing, but you can apply it to risk. When there's a single point of failure and things are asymmetrical, you got to think differently. It's existential if something happens. It's no longer probabilization or risk management thing. I actually created a C-suite position called the Chief Existential Officer, which is different from the sort of CRO and all that, precisely because, and both for positive and negative, it's not just, asymmetry and disruption affects both positive and negative, right? So the point here that I'm trying to make is that the Starlink example I was trying to give is, if you take Viasat, which are the traditional satellites, they've been built for half a century, we understand them well. It took Moscow 10 seconds to deactivate them when they invaded Ukraine, okay? Because there was a single point of failure. And then you look at slightly decentralized, different kind of models, but less efficient, maybe sometimes patchy, but effectively Starlink, 2 years hence, we've still not, Russia or those who wish to, those bad state actors or bad agents who wish to deactivate Starlink haven't been able to. So it's the difference between fragile and anti-fragile. And I think when you're thinking about resiliency in systems and risk management, a lot of organizations still don't appreciate that you need to build anti-fragility in the system, the way Nassim Taleb uses it. And that is recognizing the asymmetrical aspects of the world. And effectively, anti-fragility is, well, first of all, you're going to try where possible to avoid a single point of failure. If you're fragile and there's a shock that happens, you could be dead. It could be the end of it because of the nonlinearity and asymmetry. When it's anti-fragile, it's resilient. And not only is it resilient in terms of, like in the rubber band, you can break it, punch it, it doesn't move, doesn't get better, but it doesn't get worse. But anti-fragile, you're actually thinking about, okay, what features can I have in our human capital, in our organization, in our strategy, whereby we're built to receive shocks constantly. We're resilient for that, or variations or changes. We actually learn from that and maybe even reinforce ourselves from that. And that mindset is very important, I think, for foundations to what managers take. So if I recap now, I would say point number one is, what is scenario analysis? Are you still relying on the same model for an answer and assuming you sort of have a stable, predictable world versus scenarios in the broader sense of unpredictability? Number two is, are you building something that is more anti-fragile than fragile, that likes shocks, that likes mistakes, that learns from it? And number three, are you really appreciating different operating system that allow you to make sense and make decisions in an environment which is deeply unpredictable? And again, both for value creation and for value destruction. It's not just a risk management thing. Some of the things we're talking about apply both for things that could be positive or negative.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you were talking, I was actually trying to go through my experience, say, in scenario planning, etc. And you're absolutely right. I think when looking back, they were all linear in nature in the way you described them. There is one area which is different, but again, it's a different approach compared to what you just described. I think listening to you, one thing that came to mind is it seems standardization in the context of what you described is the enemy of what you that agility that you're mentioning. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that if you have a view? I'd be just curious to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, no, this is a fantastic segue, because effectively, for me, it's the hinge that connects anti-fragility with fragility. So for me, efficiency is to fragile what effectiveness is to anti-fragile. And so, although you use the word standardization, and correct me if I'm misreading it, my sense is that through standardization, you're thinking about replicable, predictable, playbook. You're using either your experience or your expertise or things which are kind of
and you make
linear.
You create
Exactly.
That linearity you mentioned.
Yeah, and that's and that works in a world which is, what we used earlier for complicated. It's linear. There are known unknowns, et cetera, et cetera. Now, for an asymmetric, nonlinear, complex world, indeed, you're looking for efficacy. You're looking for effectiveness rather than efficiency. And I would almost say that one of the key features in Nassim Taleb's Anti-Fragility, and I'd recommend, for those who aren't familiar with it, my guess that it's probably one of the most important books for all of your audience. Anybody who's listening to these topics should be interested in Nassim Taleb and his Insurto collection and Anti-Fragility in particular, to my mind. But the idea of buffer and slack in a standardized, optimized, Newtonian, mechanical, linear, complicated world, slack and inefficiencies are bad things, right? And it's true that if the world is clockwork and predictable, stable, controllable, and linear, why would you not be hyper efficient and all that? The challenge is that we're not in that world, and less so. And the cost of assuming that we're in that world is increasing. So you see it whether it's supply chain or whether it's...
I was going to say that with the supply chain and just in time is a typical example of that, isn't it?
Very much. But you can also take it for value creation. Look at Zoom. When the pandemic hit, why was Zoom able to do so well, even though they had 10 or 12, not 10, I'm probably 100 or 1,000, though I forget the numbers, I had them somewhere, of overnight, more demand of users of their system and platforms. And it's not that they didn't have issues with privacy, and there's some, famous cases, but they were very anti-fragile. They had slack, they had buffers, they had, the ability to the infrastructure to subsist multiple times overnight. When the issues arose, they learned from them. It's a bit like share buybacks or the airline industry. You go to your business school and your MBA, and they'll teach you about capital structure and what's optimized balance sheet and leverages and capital pricing. All these things are great in a stable, predictable, linear, understood world, which is not the world we live in. So the minute something happens, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a financial crisis, whether it's just the everyday world as we live it today, that cash from the balance sheet disappears. You don't have it. So you could sort of say, well, Google, NVIDIA, all these companies, it's ridiculous for them to have tens or if not in some cases hundreds of billions of dollars of cash. It's not complying to my MBA at Harvard, whatever, yada, yada, which is effectively just bullshit anyway, because the fact is that it is anti-fragile to have that buffer and slack and inefficiencies. You learn from them. It gives you optionality, flexibility. They resist shocks. You can deploy things at a time where other people are begging for money from the governments or going bust or whatever. So this whole idea is coming back to a question around standardization, which I'm kind of using as a proxy also for efficiency, is exactly, you've hit the nail on the head. And that's why I like so much the important concept of anti-fragility, because once you deal with all the optimized, efficient, standardized, you're in that box where risk management in the conventional way works, where things are complicated, where things are stable, etc. Once you're in the other things we've talked about around nonlinear, unpredictable, asymmetrical, etc., then you need things where standardization or efficiency, etc., move to effectiveness. What is effective? How is it effective to think about future scenarios versus what is the efficient model telling us that can be modelized? You can't modelize out risk or uncertainty, however good your model is. There's no data on the future, and especially this unpredictable one.
Well, I'm not a quant, so to be fair, I never used models in a sense you just described. For me, it was always understanding that environment in the way you described. As you were explaining what you just said, there's one thought that that came to mind as well, and you touched on that nuance in your book as well. The nuance between, and you talked about it, complexity and something that is complicated. And it does feel to me that, and perhaps you're going to correct me there, but that organization to be ready to manage that uncertain environment you mentioned should try to remove the complexity so that they can deal more adequately with the complication, so they can deal better with the complexity. And I'm saying that because I've seen organizations that got so complicated that they became complex for the wrong reasons, but also because they are so focused on managing that complication that they can't deal with what is complex. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastically interesting topic, and I completely agree. Effectively, it's, if you believe that you can control complexity, to your point, which is, you said it in a very insightful way, so I hope I'll do it justice or not. But if you believe that, then indeed it's as you're describing it. You're going to put structures and organizations and a number of things which you believe through those structures are going to sort of help manage and control uncertainty and all that. And it's the opposite. It's the anti-fragile and the organizations that allow the sort of cognitive, emergent, and strategic agility of adapting and adaptive systems and that are decentralized, and they're not hierarchical, and they're probably more heuristic than supercomputers programs, and they are inefficient and they slack, and people stumble upon things and pick themselves up, and there's trial and error. And and these kind of environments, of course, are hard to get right. And also, when you go to a consultant, which I attribute very little value to, particularly some of them who should be in jail, but more about that and no names some other time. But when you think about that, those playbooks are basically treating the world as complicated, building structures and models and decisions and AI and all these things on the basis of that controllability. And in fact, it should be the opposite. How do you harness that? There's a very interesting, I think he was the founder of Visa, which is Lee Dock, if I'm not mistaken, who came up with this word chaotic, which is a combination of chaos and order. And this is some decades ago, but he, needless to say, quite a brain and already touching upon these topics. And a lot of these topics aren't new. What's new is that the cost of ignoring them is going through the roof, and then there's no kind of just, one big event and then 2 years later things go back to normal. So it's more systemic and that. But the topics themselves are not new. And in this chaotic, which is chaos plus order, or even anti-fragility. If you look at Nassim Taleb and you look at the words and the features of anti-fragility, they are the things which would make sick most consultants or CEOs probably, because first of all, they'd realize that it's not the way the organization is and the way what they've learned at wherever. It's not the way the governance structures are. It's not the way the incentive structures are. And so, but it is precisely inefficient, this slack, decentralized, non-hierarchical, heuristic, kicking tires, trial and error in ways which don't fit the narrative, the executive education programs, the MBAs, the governance structures or incentive structures of most organizations today. But they are ill-suited and ill-adapted and not updated to the reality of our world and the stakes.
Well, one word that comes to mind is agility, right? In the way you described it, and that those complicated structure are are impending that agility in a way and leading to what you just outlined. Which is also why we're thinking about making that distinction so useful between complicated and complexity. Because the complexity is something as well that comes from an external environment that we can't control. But actually, the complicated is something you can very much control because usually it's self-inflicted, right? And especially if I look into my former role and activities, I've seen that time and again where we spend too much time on those aspects which are complicated without dealing with the complex. Because it absorbs too much resources actually for the wrong reason, where the resources should be allocated to the point you just made, which is be able to be agile, make sure the organization can pivot, create slack, create redundancy by design almost, so that the organization can adjust to an environment that is completely uncontrollable. With that, I'd like to, and I think you've touched on already on quite a number of those aspects, but perhaps you might have a few more ideas. How does strategic foresight influence decision-making in that environment? Do you have anything else you'd like to add to that?
Just wrapping up on the previous points, you're right. The sort of fragile, you basically have a complicated control structures in order to control simplified environment. And in the anti-fragile or the cognitive and emergent and strategic agility, you have a simplification of the control structures in order to be more responsive to complexity. So it's kind of the paradox. I really just wanted to kind of reiterate that because I think you through your questioning and reactions, you put your finger on it. And that's the kind of paradox, which of course most people don't really appreciate, but you're actually wanting to simplify the control structures in order to be more responsive to complexity. And that's something that's not easy to do and certainly not understood by most.
Here I will say what I told you before we started that discussion, which is I think people again should read your book, because until I started reading it, I never made a distinction between complicated and complexity. I always frame as things are complex. Well, actually, no, they are not complex. They are complicated. And we can't control the complex, but we can actually address the complicated when it's required. And for me, based on the discussion we're having now, I'm seeing the need to do that when that prevents the ability and the agility of an organization to respond to its wider environment, which is very much a structural risk for an organization. It is far more important than any other risk they will have on their book if they cannot adjust to an uncontrollable environment.
Yeah, no, completely. And the challenge is the relying on the controllability of the environment. And it's not so much that, you make certain assumptions and you have to do certain things, but the danger is when you rely on that to the exclusion of anything else. And that's where the price can be very high. Or the missed opportunity. And then to your question, if I understood it correctly around, and it's my fault, I kind of moved on to sort of wrapping up on the previous topic, but around how strategic foresight tools can, link to
decision-making.
To decision-making and strategy.
Strategy.
Yeah. So the first thing I think is important is that one shouldn't be dogmatic. When you're looking at we shouldn't be dogmatic, and these are not necessarily either or decisions. So it's not that everything is wrong. Like, we talked about the danger of assumptions, or, it's not that it's wrong to make assumptions. There's no way of operating without making some assumptions. The danger is, what else are you thinking about? And are you relying on those assumptions to the exclusion of everything else? So when Germany relied on the assumption of a strong strategic partnership with Russia, to help inform their military budget, strategy, and energy security, that cost of that assumption was very high. Or in the case of the Fed with interest rates, or the other central banks, when Yellen kind of said, okay, we didn't realize we could control inflation. We thought we could control inflation. We can't. And suddenly inflation is the highest it's been for more than half a century. And, it's not a problem that they have economists and statisticians and econometricians. It's not a problem that they run models and then that something comes out of it and that they do sensitivities. The problem is when they rely on that exclusively to the exclusion of any other possibilities. Not to mention that if you're printing money for 20 years, you might realize that maybe that could be inflationary and that things feed each other also with some of the other systemic geopolitical and other economic and technological changes. But so coming back now to then how strategic foresight feeds into strategy and decision-making, these are not just either or decisions. In other words, some of the things that work in risk management and strategy are not necessarily bad. You don't have to erase everything. I think the important thing is to do so with more humility, with less of a kind of absolute certainty that you have an understanding of the world and its outcomes. Because if you see the world in a broader sense with more humility, with more plurality and possibilities, as less determinate, the way you see the world will inform how you make decisions and how you prepare for the world. And that will then have an impact on how you respond to things. Because if you're seeing the world in a broader way, you'll prepare differently and make certain decisions. And then instead of firefighting emergencies every 10 seconds and I can't think about the future, there's all these emergencies, the reality is that by anticipating some of the things you might be able to, you'll prepare for some of those, and there'll be a smaller subset of emergencies to allow the emergent agile behavior for that. And so the key thing for me is really making that distinction between what environments lead themselves to traditional decision-making, strategy, risk management, and there are many. It's probably still okay to probabilize insurance policies for longevity, for certain diseases, for car accidents, or what have you. I think the challenge becomes understanding what environments and situations are complicated, known unknowns, understandable, linear, etc., and which are not. And that's staying to insurance, and might be out of my depth, but you tell me, when it moves to then insuring a house in California, and that you've always had earthquake risks, and we've sort of managed those, and that you're sort of having now extreme climate, and that translates with more fires and winds and more extreme, more frequent, because rare and never seen before is becoming all the time. We have to reframe our understanding of the world and the language we use. Rare is not rare when it happens constantly. And then when you add to that fire thing, flooding and sea levels, which is not the same as just earthquake risk, and then you see how they interconnect, and then you add other things around geopolitical or cyber, and then suddenly you're in an environment around the questions of what's insurable or not, or what can you use the conventional risk assessment, or whatever the term is, for evaluating risk? What is on one extreme potentially not insurable? And we've seen that in California, where certain insurance companies are no longer, insuring new builds and that. Some people are saying it's tactical to try and get a better price, but maybe not. And then in between, what might be insurable, but where you got to watch out not to use the old ways of thinking. And so I think, coming back to your question, I think foresight helps expand the spectrum, where you kind of, these have the features of something that is more understandable. Risk management tools work. It's fine. It's complicated. It's linear, but we understand. this is more systemic disruption and change, and maybe we need to think about our chief existential officer, and it's asymmetric and complex, and what are those features and what are the implications for strategy, for decision making. And so when you're in domains which are deeply unpredictable and where the stakes, both for positive and negative or value creation or value destruction, are asymmetrical and nonlinear, that's where scenario planning, and not just scenario planning, but as part of that foresight, because foresight for me is also resiliency and anti-fragility, become important, because you're no longer just modelizing risk to manage it. You're realizing that some of it is unmanageable, and maybe you need to build the resiliency in the systems. And that's a different decision from just avoiding a certain course of action, which you believe will mean that you're avoiding specific outcomes because you don't know. And those outcomes might be existential.
Yeah, and your example in the insurance industry and insurability of assets, for example, which you touched on, again, playing back some things I heard not long ago, especially from a political sphere, it becomes more and more of a concern, right? Where having more and more insurance companies retrenching completely, say, of insuring housing in California, because the level of unpredictability creates too much uncertainty, which they don't want to deal with. And for me, that also touched on a broader strategic question on the insurance, which is fundamentally based on linear models. However complex those models are, and they are very complex, right? I get that. They're still based on linearity and predictability, ultimately. And the entire pricing model in the insurance industry is based on that. So when we listen to you, effectively, the consequence of that is, well, that business model is pretty much dead in the water, because the environment in which we operate today doesn't lend itself to that, at least for part of what they do as a business.
Yeah, you're spot on. So you need to kind of either update it or do things differently. And the point around, it's interesting what you said with insurability, and we've seen it also in France and certain regions and many parts of the world. And it's why we use. I kind of didn't mention this early on in our chat. The book is called Disrupt with Impact: Achieve Business Success in an Unpredictable World. And the disrupt is really the idea of disruption being systemic. And one of the features of the complexity and the nonlinear is that it's systemic, and that means that you can't isolate it or replicate it or standardize it, as you say, or it's not discrete. And that's why you have this overflow where things are interconnected, where something that might seem like risk management is actually political, and then also geopolitical, and then maybe related, because in the end, these things are all interconnected, and there comes a point where you can't necessarily isolate and separate those risks or those features or those environments, and that it itself creates a different environment. And so the example of, so you can't draw those lines. Things are liminal between, individual, society, corporate, regions, countries, and that is also a feature, because you can't kind of isolate things necessarily, because that isn't the way a feature of complexity. It's precisely not a Newtonian, discrete, isolated features in the system. It's systemic. So
if you were to give some advice to risk managers in that context, right? And you've already took a stab at drawing some of the nuances between foresight and risk management. But in my view, it is fundamental for risk management to interconnect with what you mentioned, because that's the nature of the world we live in. It's only going to go even more complex and unpredictable from here. So what do you think risk managers should do to adapt the way they work, the mindset, the frameworks?
So there are a few things. I think, in no particular order, but I'll use numbers just to help the flow. So the first thing is really that appreciation of risk, uncertainty, and deep or radical uncertainty. whether it's my definitions or nuances or whatever, it really doesn't matter. The important thing is there is a spectrum, and we are probably moving more towards a sort of radical uncertainty, and that has implications by definition for risk and that. So I think that's number one. I think the second thing is the same distinction, but for sort of complex versus complicated. What is kind of more linear? What is kind of asymmetric, nonlinear, complex, etc. And then the third element, I think it's this idea of the plurality of plausible events that might happen, precisely because we are in deep uncertainty and things are nonlinear. And I think that should normally, lead to an aha moment around the need to think more broadly and adapt, whether it's insurance models or business models or risk assessment or whatever you're looking at. You're going to probably see that differently, and therefore you're going to prepare and make decisions differently, and that will most likely lead to an appreciation of resiliency in systems and those features. Resiliency is between fragile and anti-fragile, but certainly realizing the dangers of fragility, because ultimately, however small the probabilities, you're in a different game when it's asymmetric. And one of the things we do, without wanting to kind of blow my own trumpet on that, is and I think you touched upon it either in our earlier chat or during the talk around the so what. In the end, this is the starting point. Once you appreciate that, these are what I call kind of aha moments or realizations. You then need to manifest that in terms of what are the tools, what are the frameworks, what are the illustrations, and that to help yourself and in your business inform and make decisions. We do that in our own way. Disruptive Futures Institute is a content and education platform which is primarily trying to support individuals, organizations, institutions to build future preparedness, futures intelligence, and resiliency around the reality of the world, which we deem to be, unpredictable, nonlinear, complex, and uncontrollable. And we don't necessarily see those as negative things. They also, when you look at trillions of dollars that are going to shift in terms of value, you're looking at both value destruction and value creation. So it's not just a risk management thing and that. So all I would say is that for anybody who's invested the time and effort in the busy lives to listen to your excellent podcast, Julian, hopefully some of these ideas will help in leading down a rabbit hole to answer the so what questions. And then as you explore, there's a lot, whether it's our material or others, my book, what have you, which is emergent, and people will kind of see read acrosses, implications, and ask the so what question for myself. But what's almost certain is that the outcome will not be a status quo. If you're going down that rabbit hole, it's unlikely to unsee these things, which is why it's so important the starting point is what assumptions and worldviews do you have, because that will inform how you prepare and respond to the world.
One thing I've been using a lot, I came across Adam Banks, who used to be the Chief Technology Officer at Merck. I don't know if you heard of him. And he had the pleasure.
Have, but I don't know his work.
So I will invite you to read about what he had to go through with Merck in 2017, when, I think using his own words, ended up being the most expensive cyber attack in history, which is probably true. And I've been using that example a lot because effectively Merck's lost everything, right? Their network technology platform was gone. And that's an example I like to use because it's actually an outcome. So it's probably not the way you will approach it, but it's an outcome. It doesn't matter how you got there. For them, they had nothing. So the question becomes, what do you do from there? And I've been using that example with a number of organizations in conferences, etc., just to see the reaction in the room around, would you present that to your board? It's not even plausible it happens. So you could be in that situation tomorrow. Is that something organizations actually use nowadays? And the answer is no. Because, no, it's too extreme. well, it's not extreme enough because it happened. So if people don't plan for that, I think there's so much they can also absorb, which is also the sense of my question around what should risk manager do to help themselves and also their broader organization in going into that direction, because I think risk management plays a critical role there, as strategy, the strategic function probably does as well.
Yeah, no, it's a great example. And it's one of the reasons why I kind of put the sort of, I think risk officers should also be chief existential officers, CO2s. In other words, both for opportunities and negatives, what is asymmetric that could be existential? And that's a different filter from every day, because then it's no longer extreme. It's part of your job to think of plausible existential risks and opportunities in our asymmetrical world. And the other thing I would say, just as a kind of bouncing on that as a quick comment, is it's a fascinating concept, and it brings also back to the Russian roles, because that's existential at the level of the organization, no doubt. But what's crazy is that these similar considerations around cyber or other can be existential around literally the US or California or the Western world or whatever, because there's so many different single points of failure and such a lack of resiliency, because everything's been built in a siloed way and all that. And, the question is it really, would it have been more expensive had the world thought about it, just like the same analogy with the satellites, Starlink versus Viasat? If we build the world to be more resilient and thought about these things and avoiding single points of failure, would we be as vulnerable? Whereas today, whether it's state actors, bad agents, or even just simply erratic things we don't understand of technology, we're very exposed to the equivalent at the Maersk level, but at another meta level, which could be existential for segments of society or humanity in its extreme case. A prolonged lack of electricity or energy or communications. I'll let you just imagine, California, we'd have no water after a week because we rely on electricity. So it doesn't take much when, again, the efficiency versus effectiveness and discussion we had earlier.
We have very little slack in our environment in general, to use the term you used. But I think if we could spend probably an entire 2 or 3 hours just talking about those things. So here sure. I'm going to take our discussion perhaps to a close. You've already touched on so many things, but I'd like to get one thought on, in your view, what would be one misconception about risk leadership you could think about, and what advice would you give to emerging leaders in that field?
It would probably be around this idea of what foresight is and the purpose, because the preconception is it's too long term, you can't predict the future, who knows? And therefore, they then just concentrate on the present and make the assumptions and rely on the assumptions and everything we've talked about. And it's completely the opposite paradox. It's the same discussion we had about the simplified control structures to manage better the responsiveness to complexity. Basically, once you understand that you're not trying to predict the future, you're actually trying to just be future prepared, futures intelligent and resilient, these are no longer either or decisions. Of course, every day you should be thinking as a foresight practitioner and building that in, because you're not trying to predict. It actually isn't to inform the decision-making today, and it's to help you prepare today and be more resilient. So I think that misconception has ramifications which make people pivot to immediacy, simplicity, linearity, etc., and which would be okay if it was effective, but it's not effective in today's environment.
And for me, it's absolutely the role of risk management to do that, by the way. So probably hence my question. I'm not sure you gave a TED Talk, but I can't remember saying it, but perhaps you did. But if you were to give a TED Talk, what would it be about?
I haven't actually. I don't even know if it's on my list of the things I'm trying to do, but for some reason I never bothered and haven't yet got around to it. I might. The topic... there's a topic which I find important, which is related to everything we've talked about, which is effectively the end of trends. I use the word meta-ruptions instead of meta-trends to illustrate this unpredictability. And I think in a way it would be, what's the sense-making, decision-making, and implications of the end of trends, which is effectively of being an unpredictable world on that. So it probably play with that theme. There's a second close best, and you're watching the time, and I probably shouldn't be doing this, but which is this idea that I haven't talked about, but which is heavily in the book, which is tech existentialism, which is existentialism in the 21st century, when humans no longer have exclusivity on decision-making, and when decision outcomes can come from machines. What are the implications for humans? What is existentialism, freedom, agency, and choice in this 21st century, where being in the world is being in the technological world? So I call this tech existentialism, as in technology plus existentialism. So that would be a close second, but it's a little bit less straightforward for buzzwordiness wise.
Well, I look forward to the TED talk. I must say, I will be keeping an eye on those developments. And what's the most rewarding part of what you do?
The most rewarding for me is basically the multiplier effect, because although my starting point was we try to make a living and etc. I care deeply about these topics, and that's why I feel I'm very lucky, because the most rewarding is that by doing what I'm doing to be sustainable financially, I'm spending time on topics not only that I enjoy, but that I feel are actually literally survival skills for 8 billion people and the world. And I'm not trying to say I'm doing amazing stuff. I'm just saying these topics are important, and it so happens that I enjoy work on these topics, and therefore they have the pathways and propensity to have a multiplier effect on topics that matter. I'm deeply concerned about the lack of updatedness of our educational systems, incentive structures, governance structures to be relevant in our current world, let alone thrive in it.
It's a massive split between starting in accounting and moving into full world. Accounting being by its very nature very predictable and designed for that, to being moving completely the polar opposite, by the way.
I know, right?
I appreciate the split here. What's the most recent book or podcast or article that had a big impact on your thinking, if any?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily the most recent, but I know you had as a guest Michelle Walker, and I was fortunate enough to have her endorse, actually one of the endorsers for my book. But I stumbled upon, Grey Rhino just under a decade ago. Actually, I think she wrote it about a decade ago, but I probably stumbled upon it 6-7 years ago, if I remember correctly. And for me, that was one of the most important books I've read, together with probably Nassim Taleb and his Incerto series. And for those who know those books and themes, they'll see how they relate to everything we've discussed. And for those who don't and discover them, you'll see how they touch upon these things and beyond. So these, for me, are extraordinarily important work for all of the things we've talked about, and again, for humanity more generally.
Well, you touched on the notion of known unknowns, right? So, which is very central to the notion of grey rhinos. So I invite people to listen to the podcast on that, and also to read our book, because it's a fantastic book. I completely agree with you. And what is the one tool you always have with you?
What is the?
One tool.
One tool. It's I really enjoy Eastern philosophy and Zen Buddhism. And so I try and remind myself of those. I don't know if they're a tool, but Choshin is beginner's mind. Mujo is in transience. It's similar to what I call systemic disruption. Change as a constant, and I just find that they help. And I find it, again, talking about the paradoxes of the simplified structures for the complexity, and it's all these paradoxes of my starting as an accountant and finishing as whatever I am today, lion tamer. I find it interesting because in our technological, highly advancing, changing world, etc., I actually think some of these tools around, critical thinking and the philosophers or Zen Buddhism are probably those that are the most helpful.
Well, at the very least, part of it is based on the fact you can't control on the environment we're in, right? So this is about preparing ourselves for that.
Very much so.
And finally, where can people learn about yourself and also find your book, by the way?
No, thanks for asking, Julien. Well, Google is a good source, or not that I'm everywhere on Google, but I would say that the Disruptive Futures Institute is the organization. We try and have a lot of content, including a lot that's free on social media. And that's the umbrella for the content and the education of the Disruptive Futures Institute. If you Google my name, it will link to many podcasts, articles, and various other things, a lot of which are also free. The book is called Disrupt with Impact, Achieve Business Success in an Unpredictable World. It was published relatively recently, and it's available in most parts of the world, most platforms, although we established that it wasn't as an ebook on Apple. But effectively, both stores and digital platforms. It's a book that can be purchased. It's published by Kogan Page. And stay tuned for some of our courses, especially on the sort of sustainable futures and climate foresight coming in 2025.
Well, Roger, with that, thank you so much for that discussion. I think it was as insightful as it gets. So I personally really enjoyed it. And I wish you best of luck for 2025. I think you already had a very busy 2024, and I think you're already planning for next year and beyond, and keep changing the world, or trying to.
Thanks so much, Julian, and thanks for all the resources and effort you're putting into yourself multiplying and amplifying these important topics.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of RiskMasters today. I hope you found our discussion with Roger Spitz insightful and thought-provoking. From thinking scenario planning to embracing asymmetry and anti-fragility, Roger has shared invaluable strategies on how organizations can move beyond resilience and build systems that thrive under uncertainty. This concludes part 2 of our discussion. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like, follow, and leave a review. Your feedback helps us continue bringing you top insights from industry leaders. For show notes, additional resources, and related articles, please visit ivtm.com. Stay connected and join us next time for more conversation on risk management, leadership, and resilience. I will have the pleasure of welcoming Emmanuel Salmona, CEO of Nagomi Security, and we will be talking about cybersecurity. And remember, embrace uncertainty, challenge assumptions, and shape the future of risk management. Until next time, I'm Julien A., and this has been RiskMasters.
Thank you for joining us on RiskMasters today. If you're ready to master risk and unleash your full potential, here's how you can take the next steps. First, head over to julianhay.com to discover even more valuable insights from our RiskMasters. We've got a treasure trove of knowledge waiting for you. Second, don't miss out on future episodes. Hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcasting platform. Stay tuned for fascinating discussions on risk management. And third, if you found today's episode valuable, please share it on social media. Help others discover the world of RiskMasters and embark on their journey of risk mastery. Remember, success favors the bold. See you on the next episode of RiskMasters.